Warzone over the last 2 years has been this ever-evolving mass that has had a lot of hurdles, but ultimately offered a lot as well. But what the future holds is certainly interesting, because as we know it right now, Warzone will seemingly be lasting until relatively this time next year as rumored. Afterwards, we'll end up seeing the launch of a Warzone 2, a fully upgraded and independent experience, whereas this current experience is currently tied to things like Modern Warfare's EXE or application file. So there's a potential for a ton of changes fundamentally and technically speaking to happen with that launch. But for the next year, that's still a huge gap in time. So what's next for what we know of Warzone right now? Today, I want to talk about an interview that developer Josh Bridge did with former COD pro, now streamer for Optic, TP, in which he talked about a handful of high-level things that I'm sure are of interest to a lot of you. Whether it be the topic of that rumor that, oh, they'll bring back Verdansk for Warzone, the fate of ranked play, and other things that you may not think about immediately, like potentially the idea of weapon vaulting. Today, we're going to end up looking at all of that and see what has been said from one of the ones calling the shots here for Warzone. So as we go along, let me know your thoughts down below if there's anything that you would like to see in the future here of Warzone, or if these changes, or perhaps in some cases, lack of changes, if it's anything that interests you or that you like the sound of. But if you enjoy the video, you enjoy the discussion at hand, do me a favor and drop a like on the video. And if you're new to the channel, do be sure to hit the subscribe button to stay up to date with all things Warzone here on the channel. If you want to stay up to date with all the latest news, information, updates, tips, tricks, loadouts, and more, we've got you covered here on the channel, and I'd love to have you in the community. And finally, if you'd like to support the channel a little further, an entirely optional way to do so is by using creator code Espresso in the in-game shop of either Vanguard, Cold War, Modern Warfare, or Warzone. Again, it is entirely optional. Do not ever feel pressure to do so, but if you decide to, tweet me a picture. I'd love to shout out some of your generous support in upcoming videos. That said, let's jump right into it. So again, today's insight comes from Josh Bridge, creative lead for what they call Chapter 3 for Warzone, which is Chapter 3, just the third game iteration here of Warzone. Modern Warfare 2019 was Chapter 1, Black Ops Cold War is Chapter 2, and Vanguard now is Chapter 3. Again, this debuted in a stream with former COD pro, now Warzone streamer, TP. Now, there were a lot of things discussed here, but some of the big topics we'll cover here is kind of the initial intent for Warzone, the prospect of some weapon vaulting or seasonal vaulting happening, the possibility of Verdansk ever coming back, ranked play, and then a nice little note on some weapon tuning. Now, starting out with that sort of initial intention for Warzone, this was something that further clarified the idea that Warzone was never meant to be a multi-year game. Bridge ended up mentioning that this was something that was only ever intended for that initial year. They thought that it would last about 12 months after its launch here, but it was never made and designed with 180 plus weapons at the end of Chapter 3 here in mind to be integrated. It was never something that they intended for 2,000 plus blueprints to have in mind, and of course, that then can reflect in this sort of memory space that's required for this. We ended up seeing over the past year and a half or so that cloud-based, say, textural streaming was created for that to try and mitigate some of those issues, to take off some of that larger load in terms of file sizing. Caldera was actually authored with that kind of stuff in mind, where he said they gave a lot more headroom. So whether it's something that you like Caldera or not, from a technical perspective, it was something that was made to try and clear these hurdles a little bit easier. But he also did mention that something that they're trying to tackle here going forward is what he described as mode salad, where right now there's just so many things that players can play within the game that it kind of makes it a little bit overwhelming for the average player. That's something that maybe to you or I, we quite like having the ability to play standard BRs, solos, duos, trios, quads, Rebirth Island, solos, duos, trios, quads, and a couple of LTMs mixed in there as well. But he said that that's something that they're trying to mitigate here going into the future, where just like Vanguard Royale, they folded that into the traditional BR experience to try and mitigate some of those 4 playlists here with that. So good or bad, depending on how you look at it, that's something that we'll be seeing here going forward. Now, TP ended up stumbling across the discussion here of weapon vaulting and seasonal vaulting, because they were talking about how there's memory constraints. There's, again, that sort of, instead of mode salad, gunplay salad, there's a bunch of balancing issues that can go into play here with this, because with 180 plus weapons, how do you balance everything without having crossover of weapon attributes, where you have the exact same recoil pattern, you have the exact same damage statistics, things like that. And to a degree, we already kind of see that with some weapons, but how do you keep that from going out of hand? And the topic of weapon vaulting in taking certain weapons and making them the applicable meta or just seasonal loot pool, that was something that was brought into the discussion here, where they said that they could hyper focus on weapons in a singular season and rotate weaponry in and out, allow for a less overload on that sensory and trying to build out your weapon, plus also just the weapons overall and balancing. So from a player perspective, you have an easier understanding, less things to memorize each season, and also from a developmental standpoint, you have less things to try and mitigate balancing wise to make each individual weapon unique in its own right. So that's something that they said may not necessarily be on the immediate horizon, but has been brought into the discussion. And as Bridge mentioned, it is something that Raven is trying to gauge community feedback more and more. That's why we ended up seeing that Twitter poll talking about the health increase before it happened, where they asked, do you want to see the Vanguard Royale plus 50 health increase come over into the actual traditional BR experience? And that was something that was overwhelmingly voted yes for, and was the first time that we really saw direct feedback posed from a question from Raven and the developers to us, and we could give that immediate and direct feedback on what we thought. That's something that he said they may end up doing for something like this in the future. But then also they got to the topic of discussion of Verdansk possibly coming back, because it is something that they said they've seen the feedback, both TP and the streamer side, and also of course developers as well, in which Verdansk is a topic that they know people love that map. So would it ever be to the point where once they tackle those technical hurdles that we just mentioned, perhaps in a Warzone 2 with a full-fledged application, maybe more memory allocated, would it be like, okay, maybe we have a map rotation where just like a traditional Call of Duty multiplayer experience, you can vote on a map before you jump into the game? Would that be something that we could see? Or perhaps a seasonal vaulting system where each season you have a new map that you can play on? Now, Bridge chimed in here at this actually almost immediately, saying we all want that. But he also mentioned that there's a plethora of technical issues that go along with that. The biggest one being install and reinstall sizing. He said it was verbatim crazy, where you'd essentially have to re-download the near size of Warzone every time a new season would come into play. Now, those sort of major updates that large, he ended up saying that they lose tons of players every time that is posed. So that's why we try and mitigate these update sizing as much as possible, especially when a majority of players are on console, where it's already taking up a huge amount of that hard drive space. So to end up having to essentially re-download a game before it then sort of flushes out that old version of it, you're going to end up needing much more sizing in that hard drive before it ends up wiping the rest. And so therefore players just wouldn't do that. They have statistical evidence of that happening in the past, so it's a very big hurdle they have to clear. So for that, I kind of wouldn't expect that to happen until maybe a Warzone 2, where you can then end up purging a huge base of what Modern Warfare actually is and just have Warzone as itself, which would presumably be at its base a much lower file size than opposed to if you have the core Modern Warfare elements also in the mix. They did say that they want to sort it out on a technical level so that it would be possible in the future, but right now that's just an idea they have. They also mentioned because of this, a lot of the last gen and current gen support being a big hurdle for performance. That's something that causes problems because there is still so many people still on last generation that you're kind of stretching yourself thin by developing things to push the boundaries on current generation, but also allow players on last gen to keep up. So that's something that you're going to have to iron out here in the future as well. Now, as for the ranked play topic, that was something that they kind of led into with the discussion of Iron Trials, talking about these game modes here that were up on deck in the past, where you try and keep the casual player happy, but also you try and please the hardcore player, the ones that have days upon days upon days, if not weeks, into the game itself. Iron Trials was kind of that sort of stepping stone here, where they could try and play around with the developmental question of, do you try and up the skill gap of the core mode, or do you introduce a more sweat-based mode like Iron Trials ended up turning out to be? He ended up saying that they can't wait to get to ranked play because that's what we ultimately need, talking about in regards to giving high-skill players something to grind out in the game. They said that they just want to do it right. They don't want to take it lightly. They want to evaluate it, and it's going to take time to build out, but they eventually want to do it. And again, kind of coming down to that, I also don't really know if I see this launching anytime within Warzone 1. If it's something that they're still in the sort of preliminary thought process here of building it out, building an entire system, a ranking system itself too, I feel like that's also something that's going to have to be launched, if not post-launch of Warzone 2, where we still may be a year out, but it is something that they did explicitly say they are aware of and they're looking forward to, which is basically, out of all of the communication with Raven so far, the thing that I love the most. They're not trying to hide behind any PR thing or anything like that. They're just coming out straight up and saying what's on their mind here at the given time. With Season 2 and that pre-briefing that myself and other creators had, they ended up coming out and saying, listen, we know that we messed up in Season 1. We're doing X, Y, and Z to mitigate this and to make the game better for Season 2. And with everything that we've seen since then, it seems like they're trying to keep that level of transparency open with the community so that they know what's going on and they have an accurate representation of what's going to be in the future. And that's something that I can absolutely commend. Now, rounding out this video here, one thing that absolutely was just refreshing to hear is that Josh Bridge did mention that there's going to be weapon tuning for the Bren finally. Now, they didn't give any ETA if I were to guess here. The next weapon tuning pass will probably be like Season 3. We don't usually get weapon tuning mid-season unless there's something tremendously broken, which yeah, the Bren's kind of broken, has been since the integration, but it is something that's probably the next time we'll see those things tackled. So for those like me that are just incredibly bored of the Bren, this is music to our ears. So that said, that's what I wanted to talk about here with you guys, the big sort of high-level things out of a recent chat with a developer that we've seen out there. And it gives some adequate information and insight into the future of Warzone, to which I'm always interested in hearing about that. So that said, that's what we're going to call it. I'd love to get your thoughts and feedback down there in the comment section down below. Is there anything in particular that you guys really liked the sound of? Anything that you're a little bit worried about? Whatever the case, drop your thoughts down below. But if you enjoyed the video, do me a favor, drop a like on the video. And if you're new to the channel, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss a single thing regarding all things Warzone. And potentially very soon here, if there's anything revealed, Modern Warfare 2 for the future. We got a lot of stuff up on deck here the next couple of weeks to months, so stick it here on the channel if you guys are at all interested in any of that. But that said, thanks so much for watching. Mine has been Espresso. I'll see you guys later. Take care, and peace.